It is my great pleasure to introduce Richard Gage. Richard Gage is a San Francisco Bay Area architect and a member of the American Institute of Architects. He has been an architect for more than 23 years and has worked on most types of building construction, including, this is important, numerous fireproofed, steel-framed buildings. Since founding Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth in 2006, Richard Gage has presented Blueprint for Truth all over the world, and he has made many television and radio appearances. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth now includes more than 1,500 licensed and degreed architects and engineers, all of whom are calling for a new investigation into the events at the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001. Richard Gage will present to us the evidence for the demolition of the World Trade Center buildings, an overview. Richard.
Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here in Toronto and at the Toronto hearings, where we've assembled to look at the evidence, package it, and make sure it gets used by the media, by governments, and by individuals all around the world. I represent 1,550 architects and engineers now, calling for a new investigation of the destruction of these towers. Why? Because the evidence shows, and as I believe you'll see today, that all three skyscrapers were destroyed by explosive controlled demolition. How do we know that? Because we are using the scientific method to figure out what happened that day. And in the next hour, we're going to use it in a way that NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, never did. That we're going to show you several holes in their work, particularly tomorrow with John Cole and Kevin Ryan. You've already seen some of the problems associated. So we're going to apply the scientific method. We formulate a question. How did the towers come down? We do some background research. This gives us a means of developing a hypothesis, our best guess as to what happened. Based on that research and those observations, we take our best guess. I think fire or jet plane impacts brought the towers down. Maybe controlled demolition brought them down. We don't rule out anything until the evidence itself rules it out. We test that hypothesis with experiments, and we analyze the results and draw conclusions. Now, if the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. And this is one of the chief failings of the National Institute for Standards and Technology. Transparency. And this is because the body of work can be built on by many to yield even increasing and compounding results and levels of accuracy. Now, if the hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? We go back, we find a hypothesis that does stand a better chance of being supported by the evidence. This has been around for about 100 years or more, the scientific method. It works pretty well when it's used. So let's apply it. Let's start with some background research. What are the forces that destroy buildings? This is real basic. You can do this in the 7th grade. Fire destroys buildings, certainly, okay? And we have earthquakes, natural forces, which cause organic asymmetrical collapses, as you'll see. Explosions certainly destroy buildings. And of course, explosions can be harnessed in controlled demolitions to destroy buildings quite efficiently. Now, the really neat thing about these forces is that they're very different from each other. They're easily distinguishable. And so this job actually gets pretty easy. Let's start with fires. Fire is an organic process. It moves through a building every 20 minutes or so. Burns out one area, looking for fresh new fuel sources. So when a building falls due to fire, and by the way, you'll note that never before in the history of skyscrapers have we lost one due to fire. But say in a wood frame building, the building will begin to fall over asymmetrically, not straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, but it's an organic process. It's chaotic. There'll be large deformations and so forth. So we know, we see how buildings fall due to fires. How would a building react that is steel framed, though, to a fire? Let's see.
That supported the ceiling.
When steel is bare, when it heats up,
The way in which steel-framed buildings behave in fires depends on their construction. In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
when steel is bare, when it heats up, it gets weaker. It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag. It becomes softer and sags and can no longer support the load.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Not till recently have we seen a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire. Recently means on 9/11, when we have not one, not two, but three collapsing, counter to the experimental data produced in the UK by Cardington tests, which show that without fireproofing, these steel structures do not collapse. We're talking about a 3 or 4 inch sag, that's all. We have over 100 examples of very hot, large, and long-lasting fires in steel frame skyscrapers. Not one of them has ever collapsed. For instance, the 6-hour fire over 5 floors in New York. In LA, 3.5 hours over 5 floors. In Philadelphia, 18 hours over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. Not one of these has ever collapsed. Now, here is some mid-rise buildings that have collapsed due to earthquakes. In this case, we have the building falling over to the path of least resistance. It's a chaotic process. Note that you can see at the bottom on the ground what was a building. It's recognizable as a building. The structural steel components have not dismembered from each other. The concrete is not pulverized to powder. This is really important because when we look at the 3 high-rises on 9/11, we see something quite different. Prepare yourself. These buildings were blown up with explosions. There's thick, billowing, enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like smoke with suspended solids from the pulverized building materials and concrete. The word pyroclastic comes from volcanoes, which has that characteristic, which tremendous amounts of solids are suspended in the air with a very thick edge outline, distinguishable from this solid-like mass that has a cauliflower-like shape that is expanding due to the incredibly hot gases, much hotter than office fires, for instance, can produce. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If you have these things, you know you have explosions. Note that explosions are not a part of the official story, except for the initial jet plane impacts, of course, in the Twin Towers, which happened an hour to an hour and a half before the collapse of these buildings. Let's take a look at controlled demolitions, where explosions can be harnessed quite efficiently. We have hundreds of examples from all across the country from which to make our comparison, because this is how we use explosives to demolish high-rises. So this is what a high-rise looks like while it's being demolished with explosives. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways. Normally, the purpose is to bring a structure down while avoiding damage to adjacent structures, and to do so quite efficiently. Economically, too. Typically, a tall building like these are demolished by placing thousands of cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building and then detonating them in a very precise order, progressing outward and upward, synchronistically timed floor by floor. Destroying the inner columns allows the weight of the building to pull the exterior inward, and destroying the building from the bottom up allows the weight of the building to be harnessed to do some of the destruction. So the result is an implosion, like you see here, producing a vertical, symmetrical collapse at nearly freefall acceleration into a consolidated rubble pile that's broken up and ready for loading and shipment. Now, this is a feat that only a handful of companies in the United States can accomplish. And fire, by the way, never has. So what are the typical features? We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the building. We have a straight down symmetrical collapse, often into the building's own footprint, because demolition waves remove the column supports in a synchronicity. We have a free fall speed, sometimes, through the path of what was the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structural steel in the way. And we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure, broken up, ready for loading and shipment. There's minimal damage to adjacent structures, and there's sounds of explosions heard by witnesses. There's flashes of light seen by witnesses. Enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and pyroclastic smoke. Squibs sometimes, or isolated explosive ejections that are seen in various parts of the building that are obviously explosions. And of course, there's chemical evidence left behind in the residue of cutter charges. If you have these things, any of these features, you know you had an explosive demolition. If you had all of them, you are really, really, really sure. There's no question. This is direct evidence of explosive destruction, and guess what? Fire cannot create any one of them, let alone all 10 of them. Okay? If we're aided in addition to that with government support, they've documented it in various ways. I mean, after all, you have to apply for permits for an explosive demolition, and often there is helpful documentation. Experts agree. Those without an axe to grind or a behind to cover will agree. It's a controlled demolition. Foreknowledge. These are planned months in advance. It's a huge job. And millions of dollars companies make on each one of these. So we know in advance. If you have foreknowledge, you're pretty sure it was a controlled demolition. Video documentation helps too. This is proof of a controlled demolition. So we're setting the stage, as you can see here, to try to make our effort today quite easy. Now we're going to apply that effort and that set of criteria to the third worst structural failure in modern history that most every architect and engineer in the United States and around the world know nothing about, which is in and of itself a huge curiosity at least, and more to the point, what amounts to a cover-up, censorship by the media, who knew and reported that day that this building was destroyed. In fact, it was destroyed at 5:20 in the afternoon after the Twin Towers came down. This is a 47-story skyscraper that is a football field in length away from the North Tower. Of course, it was not hit by an airplane, so we don't have the propaganda, the baggage that we have with the Twin Towers, because we all know how they came down with jet plane impacts and fires, or so we're told. So here's the building, bright and shiny in the morning of 9/11, and it continues to stand after the Twin Towers came down. It suffered some small fires here and there. I'll show those to you. What we're going to do is apply that set of criteria to Building 7 and see if any of them fit. Let's begin. Is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Let's listen to Dan Rather narrate this as we take what may be our first look at World Trade Center 7's collapse.
Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Well, Dan's using his intuition here to describe what he's seeing, and of course that's what we should all be doing. The problem is that Dan never talked about this building again after the first day. He must have been quite curious about it after describing it as a controlled demolition, basically, well-placed dynamite. And the media never played this, with very, very few exceptions that you can count on half of a hand, 3 or 4 times. So that's a real problem for many of us. Is there a straight-down symmetrical collapse of this building into its own footprint? Let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. Watch the penthouse this time. It collapses about a half a second early. Let's bring it back up. We'll be talking about why that penthouse came down. Notice the classic V formation in the top of that view, and that is why would that be done? And remember, taking the inside out first brings the walls inward. I'm not quite convinced yet, though. Let's look at side-by-side comparison here. On the left is World Trade Center 7. On the right is a known controlled demolition. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, particularly given that every high-rise that has come down with explosives, and that no high-rise has ever come down due to fires? Shouldn't NIST have used their first hypothesis should have been destruction with explosives, maybe, if not their only one? This is how obvious this becomes. Now, these are the fires that are alleged to have brought that building down. There's a couple on this side, there's a couple on the other. NIST claims there was 8 to 10 of them on various floors. None of them were larger than what you see here. And those fires are said to have caused the beginning of this building on the beginning of the destruction of this building on the 12th floor. And yet those fires were out an hour before this building came down. So the thermal expansion theory, this new phenomenon NIST came up with to try to explain this to the American people with their fancy computer models that you've heard about and you'll be hearing more of, starting with column 79 because it's under the east penthouse, which falls 6 seconds prior to the overall collapse of this building. So you might have heard already that there was some damage from the North Tower. Presumably that's the debris from the North Tower. Presumably that's how the fires had started, although the worst fires were all the way on the back side of the 12th floor, which interestingly enough was occupied by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which lost thousands of files related to hundreds of cases it was actively pursuing against Wall Street companies like Enron and WorldCom. But I didn't say that. Let's take a look at something more interesting, in fact, than that even. This is NIST's computer model. Compare it to reality. What do you see? I'll point out about 6 things that I see. First of all, it stops 2 seconds into the overall collapse. Why? Well, as you can see, it begins to tip over. Had they gone, they can't even get their own computer models to reflect the straight down symmetrical collapse of an engineered patterned set of explosives. And you can see massive bulging and indentation at the bottom, which is not reflected at all in the perimeter steel frame skeleton of the building. What else do you see? We have a massive set of failures of connections of structural steel framing that amounts to a rate of about 400 per second failing, beginning here, and look, almost instantly all the way up the building. Structural engineers will tell you that an isolated failure in a structural steel system cannot cause an instantaneous set of failures vertically throughout the building. And then NIST claims, well, then that travels laterally. But they don't even show us that. But forget that. Just the fact that we have massive failures in the structural system throughout the height of this building in the first few seconds before the overall collapse, wouldn't you expect to be seeing that reflected all the way up to the top and breaking massive numbers of windows on the side? How many windows do you see breaking here? A couple. They should all be tearing apart, massively warping. This is a real problem for NIST. I don't know why they couldn't have done better in terms of reflecting what actually happened after they've manipulated it 6 ways from Sunday from the beginning anyway. Why not go all the way? The building failure looks nothing like their model, and it falls nearly into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building, indicating symmetrical damage. How does that happen? How do you get that level of symmetry in the destruction of this building? Let's take a look at the floor plan. Maybe we can get some clues. If we don't take out all 24 core columns and all of the 50 or so perimeter columns at once, virtually simultaneously, what's going to happen? That building is going to fall to the path of least resistance. Asymmetrically, it'll fall over. That's how, and in controlled demolitions, if they have any degree of variation in the split-second timing of those explosives, they all have to go off within about 1/10 of a second of each other. The building tips over, and there are plenty of examples of failed controlled demolitions that do just that. So the question is, can fire accomplish that level of precision? All at once, all over the floor plan, and then synchronistically timed for a number of floors amounting to about 8. These 8 stories here, according to NIST, after members of AE 911 Truth that you'll be hearing from tomorrow, cornered NIST and secured their acknowledgement, their admission, that indeed this building did fall at free fall. You're going to learn about free fall tomorrow from a physicist, from a physics teacher, David Chandler. But for right now, look at the geometry of the building's collapse. It's coming down faster and faster. Each second, there's more speed, indicating gravity is in full control here. It's falling as fast as a bowling ball dropping off the side of the building. Tomorrow, we'll learn the implications of that. But they are severe, and NIST has much to account for here. Do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Remember, this was a 47-story steel frame, moment-resisting building with very rigid column to beam connections. They're welded, collapsing to a pile only 4 stories high. That pile, if it was going to collapse, should have been about 20 stories high. You masses of buildings. Remember, buildings that fall due to natural forces, they fall over the path of least resistance. There's massive building left. It's not dismembered into its individual components. It doesn't collapse like a house of cards. Do we have minimal damage to adjacent structures? Indeed. It appears to have been a good job. Maybe I could have done better myself. I could have avoided damage to this building and this one. Just kidding. I don't know how to do this. Do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions? Let's listen to Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic and first responder at the scene.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions. Like, boom! It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was a boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Well, that's interesting testimony. What about Barry Jennings, who was a manager on the 23rd floor of this building, not having gotten the word that the building was evacuated? He goes back up in after everybody else is evacuated. What did he experience?
We got to the 8th floor. I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing. When we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
All this information of bombs, not only in the World Trade Center, but in the Building 7, but in the Twin Towers as well. Surely all of these reports of explosions were taken in by the incredible job that NIST did interviewing thousands of witnesses and reporting on these. No, not one of these explosions are a part of the official story, which is quite disturbing. How about this one?
Yeah, here's one of the guys. He can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
The afternoon of 9/11. Not a part of the official story. Wouldn't we be curious about that? Do we have enormous clouds of pyroclastic-like smoke and dust? Look at this incredible level of expanding gaseous clouds racing 35 miles an hour in every direction away from the destruction of Building 7. And with a thick edge and complete set of pulverized solids filling this cloud of smoke. Much hotter than a few small office fires that you saw fueling that cauliflower-like expansion of that cloud. Do we have enormous... Oh, this is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. And I'm going to leave for you the evidence of cutter charges for tomorrow. There's lots to share there. But for right now, that's a lot of direct evidence. And guess what? None of those can be created by fire, let alone all 8 of them. In fact, if one of the World Trade Center buildings was to fall due to fire, we would expect it to be World Trade Center 5, which was completely engulfed. And did it collapse? No. Mid-rise, high-rise office buildings do not collapse due to fire. There's 40,000 tons of steel in World Trade Center Building 7. That steel, fireproofed or not, will draw that heat away from its source and distribute it out through that incredible heat sink. Let's take a look in Beijing, where we had a massive fire fully engulfing a 44-story skyscraper. And surely this one is going to collapse. Did it? No. Before, on the left, after, on the right, the building is still standing. And yet, these small office fires brought this building down after burning about 4 hours, and a lot of smoke, which is curious enough on its own, down to the ground in about 7 seconds, the total collapse. Makes no sense. But let's take a look at the FEMA report. FEMA came out in 2002 with their report, assisted by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Before the NIST report came out, what did they say? The specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Wait, you spent $600,000 on this report and you don't know how the building came down? Our best hypothesis, fire plus random damage, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute. What do you do when your best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence? Maybe we should come up with a new hypothesis that has a higher probability of occurrence. No. They say further research, investigation, and analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Unfortunately, though, for those hoping to resolve the issue, all of the steel, except for 2 pieces, which you're going to hear about tomorrow, was sent to China for recycling. Before the report came out saying, hey, we don't know how the building came out. Maybe we should look at the steel. Fascinating. Who sent the steel to China? FEMA was involved. The mayor's office was involved. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cite crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. This is the magazine that fire protection engineers communicate with throughout the United States. And what does Jonathan Barnett, who did join the FEMA team, say about a typical investigation?
When you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
Oh, that's a shame. Why was that? Because you shipped all the steel away. What's the kind of scientific method that FEMA is using here? If the evidence contradicts the fire hypothesis, destroy it. This is not science. What do the experts say? Here's an expert without an axe to grind. He's in Europe. In fact, the top European controlled demolition expert, Danny Jawenko, he said that it starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. Now, he said this before the person who was showing him on the laptop told him that this happened on 9/11. He's looking at it blindly. So what is this? It's a controlled demolition, he says. A team of experts did this. professional work without a doubt. Then they say, well, hey, this happened on 9/11. What? Sheikavator? He says, did I say that right, Niels? And he says, well, they must have worked very fast then, you know. He's still, until his untimely death recently in a car accident, he maintained that, yeah, it's a controlled demolition. As do over 60 structural engineers signed on to Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, including Kamal Obeid, who says, a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several columns at key locations within the building. Is that something fire can accomplish? Let's take a look and see if anybody knew about this building's collapse before it happened. Like, for instance, these mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7, caught on CNN camera, hearing an explosion behind them, looking back over their shoulder, and saying this into the camera.
Keep your eye on that building as they're coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. All right, guys. Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Did they have foreknowledge, or do they just assume that the fires in that building are about to blow up the building? And what about Kevin McPadden, who, before he talked about those explosions, he's talking about what he heard on a radio held by a Red Cross worker at about several blocks away, where they moved everybody back because they were concerned about this building, because they said it had some structural issues, and that's why they weren't fighting the fire, according to the word there. But here's what he hears, Kevin McPadden hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? These things need to be researched, examined under oath. People need to be brought into a real investigation. Like Jane Stanley, for instance, of the BBC, who announced the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it happened. They apologize for this grievous error, and they cite the confusing issues, the events of the day. Does this make them psychic? What is going on here? Is there some sort of script that's being read? These are questions that have to be answered. But CNN did much better. They announced it early in the morning. Let's listen.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Aaron, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a fire...
There was no other 50-story building that went down. In fact, there was no other building that went down other than the 3 skyscrapers. So 15 minutes after the second tower collapsed, we have an announcement that the 50-story building collapsed too, raising the ominous question, was it supposed to collapse at that time? Was it a dud that didn't go off? And is that why there's so much other foreknowledge supporting it? Is that why construction workers are walking out or away from the building? What are construction workers doing down there anyway? Those of us who have looked at this for a while see this as direct evidence, all these features, and fire can't count for any one of these, let alone all 8 of them. With additional supporting documentation that we went through, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition for World Trade Center 7. Now that's a problem for us. Why? Because Building 7 is a part of the overall 9/11 conspiracy, no matter how you define such a conspiracy. If we're being lied to about the cause of the destruction of this building, obviously it in and of itself requires an investigation, but because of its intimate association with the events of that day, it draws into question the other towers as well and their destruction. So at AE 9/11 Truth, inspired by the wonderful Barbara Honegger, we erected a third beam into the New York City skyline last year on the eve of 9/11 to commemorate the importance of the smoking gun of 9/11, the obvious controlled demolition, because we believe that provides the key to justice for the victims lost in the Twin Towers. And so we've adopted the three-beam icon now as our, along with our logo, if you will. We find it striking and powerful and meaningful because the Twin Towers, after we look at Building 7 and gain the respect of people who didn't know about it, much less its controlled demolition, they're much more open to looking at the evidence with the World Trade Center Twin Towers, which is actually even more clearly a controlled demolition, albeit a very different one than we've seen. Let's start with the structure. An amazing structure, unique for its time, an innovative structure that won awards from the American Society of Civil Engineers and won praise from NIST itself in its report. The structure held up to the airplanes did its job. It's just that those darn airplanes scraped all the fireproofing off, making those trusses vulnerable. We'll take a look at that more tomorrow. But this building had 47 massive core columns. At the base, almost solid steel, 52 inches by 22 inches, thinning to 2 inches at the mid-height, and to the lightest part of the structure up at the top, as little as 3/8 of an inch thick, those steel members. So when you see the building coming down in the videos, realize what we're talking about here. There's more steel on the facade of this building with these 14-inch square tube columns every 3 feet 9 inches marching across this building than there is windows. That collapse had to come down through this steel, or did it? Did the steel have to be removed to make way and cause for the collapse? We'll get to that, but there's 100,000 tons of steel in each of these towers, an incredible heat sink, again, drawing the heat away from the source of such as a fire, which is the reason steel frame skyscrapers have never collapsed, because even those fires have sometimes lasted longer than the fireproofing is designed to protect it. And so here's the official theory we have, and we'll get into more of this tomorrow, but the trusses sag as a result of the fires. That might happen, but they claim that there's an inward force, therefore, because they're pulling in the columns, because some of the photographs reveal that the columns bowed inward in the seconds prior to the collapse. So this is the column failure theory because of this. And then the top portion drives the rest of the building down because of its massive weight. The structure underneath couldn't handle that weight. That's basically the official story. Interesting to note, in order to make their computer fail, like they believe they saw in the videos, they had to apply a 5,000-pound load on every column after removing this connection. And this is completely ludicrous because there would be no additional load, or very little, from the sagging trusses pulling in these columns. And yet they saw them pulled in the videos, so they just did what they needed to do to make it work. How could those columns have been pulled in? Well, if the core columns were compromised, and tomorrow you'll look at some opportunities for such, it might have pulled this truss down with them, which would have indeed provided a lateral load on these columns, causing them to fail. So let's take a look at the Twin Towers and see if there's any evidence of controlled demolition according to our template, our criteria here, starting with, is there a sudden onset of destruction, not at the base of the structure, like we saw in World Trade Center 7, but a very different type of deceptive controlled demolition in this case. Fires doing damage because of the airplane impacts. They would want us to believe that the buildings came down due to the weakening, the structural weakening by fires. So do we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions and see flashes of light? You'll hear more of these tomorrow from Graham, who has done some extraordinary research on this subject. Listen to a couple of these first responders, though.
Making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
The whole building just collapsed on us inside the lobby.
Is that a secondary explosion?
Yes, it was.
That was the...
Yeah, definitely secondary explosion.
I heard a second explosion and another rumble.
An hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower.
It just went boom, it was like a bomb went off. And another explosion came right from it, just everything went flying.
There were numerous secondary explosions taking place in that building. There were continuous explosions.
No, the first explosion, and there was a second explosion in the same building. There were two explosions.
Okay. Federal agencies that were down there do believe that there was some sort of explosive device somewhere else besides the planes hitting.
There was another explosion that took place in one of the towers here. So obviously, according to his theory, he thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
There was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then there was some secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
That the FBI most likely thinks that there was a car or truck packed with explosives underneath the buildings, which also exploded at the same time and brought both of them down.
Now, that's the first time we're hearing that. So 2 planes and explosives that were in the building. Is that correct?
That is the working theory at this point. That is...
A huge explosion now, raining debris on all of us. It sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
About 50 consecutive bangs, and it fell down like a waterfall.
And we heard the noise associated with an implosion. We heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse before us.
We heard a loud explosion, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
At that point, we heard a large boom. I looked up and just saw the building coming at us.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse? To me, it sounded like an explosion.
There was another major explosion. The building itself, literally the top of it came down.
All of a sudden you hear explosion and you can see the building starting to collapse.
Huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We understand now there has been a secondary explosion on Tower 2.
According to the Associated Press, another building that has either been attacked or exploded.
The tower, rather, that has collapsed, that we are told, collapsed because of a third explosion.
And about an hour later after that, there was a huge explosion at the base of the South Tower. That's One World Trade Center, and part of the building collapsed.
We could hear a rumble, which was about 5 seconds long, preceding the actual collapse, and then a boom when each of those towers collapsed.
Just seconds ago, there was a huge explosion, and it appears right now the Second World Trade Tower has just collapsed.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds.
And then you heard from far away, boom, boom, and you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Floor by floor, it started popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
From the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. And as the bombs were going, people just started running. And I sat there and watched a few of them explode. And it just started going pop. It just started going boom, 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 boom. And he goes, how fast? I go, like firecrackers.
Surely some of these witnesses made it into the official reports. Not one. No reports of explosions. This is quite disturbing to the architects and engineers that I represent. Let's take a look and see what they might be referring to. Controlled demolitions can be engineered in many different ways, as I mentioned. How about belts of explosions like the first responders described, as you'll hear tomorrow? Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, just in looking at the video alone, let alone all the other evidence that witnesses will be testifying to, not witnesses, experts today? Here's the South Tower. Any similarity here to a known controlled demolition on the left? One more time. Bands of explosions starting not necessarily at the bottom, anywhere they want them to start. This is the North Tower developing its collapse. On the lower left, you can see the full plume of the upward-outward arching streamers, the pyroclastic-like clouds, a geometry of fireworks. Compare that to known explosions. Is there any similarity? And of course, this is after the first 4 seconds. You just saw the first 4 seconds. So something's going on in that first 4 seconds that's different. Let's take a look. Here's the North Tower. We're told this upper block drove the rest of the building down. The planes hit here. There's no movement down from here until about now. Once again, this upper block is destroying itself in what can only be described as a miniature controlled demolition, if you will, of the top 15 stories. There's nothing left to drive the rest of the building down at any speed. Let's look at the structure. The upper portion is the lightest. The lower portion is the heaviest. Let's compare. If you look at Newton's third law of motion, there's an equal and opposite reaction against a lighter object striking a heavier object. Hey, it's the same if you drop the lighter object onto the heavier object. Equal and opposite destructive force. Which one will give up the ghost first? Obviously, we're drawing a comparison here. And Mr. Chandler will discuss this more with you tomorrow. But take a stop, start, look now. Stop, bands of explosions wrapping all the way around the building like the first responders described. That upper portion is destroyed first. Let's take a look from below. A lot of violent activity with squibs, isolated explosive ejections occurring underneath. In a moment, we'll talk about the lateral ejection of this material. But take a close look now at the corner, where you see developing a series of explosions rapidly advancing down the corner of the building much faster than the rest of these explosions, almost as fast as the free-falling objects. And you'll see tomorrow how fast this building is coming down. How could somebody get into this building, or some group of people? Well, if one had access to the core, to the elevator shafts in the building, they would have access to the core columns and beams that occur in the building, and it would be relatively discreet. But if you had an elevator modernization going on, which we did the 9 months prior to 9/11, the largest one in the world, in fact, that might give some sort of undercover operation. So this is a source of investigation. Ace Elevator had this contract. They had 85 employees in the building at the time of the first plane impact, and they fled. These are experts that usually help the first responders rescue the victims. It was quite a scandal, actually, documented in USA Today. So wireless detonation is common in the last decade or two. There's no need to run miles of wire and so forth. We have a complete geometry of symmetry here, equally distributed debris. In fact, up to 1,400 foot diameter, landing up to 600 feet away. This is the nice, neat pile of a classic implosion, World Trade Center 7, versus the extremely explosive event known as the Twin Towers. Do we have isolated ejections occurring in the building? Well, how about here here, here. What are these? NIST tells us that these are puffs of air being produced by that giant piston. Well, we already saw that giant piston was destroyed. Any air pressure would be released upward, most likely. Also, these are occurring up to 60 stories down below this destruction. And we would expect in 60 feet of open office planning, say the elevator shaft is down at the other end, that air is going to be pushed by this non-existent piston into this room. It'll equalize that pressure fairly uniformly before it exits. And if it does, it'll blow out all the windows, or none of them, or most of them, but not these highly focalized, pinpoint accurate, geometrically precise, violent ejections of pulverized building materials, not air. Do we have a near free-fall pace through the path of greatest resistance? Stay tuned to tomorrow. And do we have a total dismemberment of the steel structure? Sure looks like it. Almost all the way down to the ground. Individual elements completely destroyed. Let's look at the South Tower. It's hit 30 stories down. It does begin to tip over a little bit, but then it's completely destroyed, almost disintegrated in this cloud. It doesn't end up in some mass on the ground below. So we have asymmetrical damage from the airplanes and the fires, and asymmetrical loading from this portion of the building, which is continuing its angular momentum, theoretically, falling 22 degrees off the building. And yet, watch what happens below. Complete symmetrical destruction all the way down to the ground, just like the first responders described. Pop, 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 bands of explosions. And this guy turned and ran, or we might have seen it come all the way. He should have stayed there. Complete, total destruction, save these shards of perimeter wall units. Ejecting lateral steel pieces, heavy structural steel pieces, free flying through the air. Not banana peeling like some suggest off of the building. No, they're achieving those lateral distances due to their initial velocity out of the side of the building, which you'll discover in tomorrow's presentation by Mr. Chandler, how enormous that force must have been, traveling up to instant acceleration with speeds 55 miles an hour or more. And we have floors that we're looking for. Now, this is a pancake and collapse. We see pancakes at the bottom. We have 110 floors in each of these skyscrapers. They're all an acre in size. We're looking for 110 floors stacked up in some mess at the bottom. How many do we see? 50? 20? 10? We don't see one. We see a two-story pile of perimeter columns and core columns. Where are the floors? Where's the concrete? I mean, we're talking 90,000 tons of concrete that's missing at the base of that building. Here it is, small particles, 100 microns in size, like talcum powder, this concrete was. And tomorrow, you're going to find out what was in that concrete dust besides concrete and gypsum that should not have been there. But this dust is composed of up to 30% concrete. It's rather extraordinary.
110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big.
Whoops, the building collapsed to dust, he says.
You have two.
And you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust, powder, 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
Everyone was basically in shock about what they were seeing down there, particularly this firefighter.
What I expected to see was nothing like what I actually did see at the time. time of my arrival at the site. There wasn't much that you could say, you could describe. Everything was dust and metal. There was no typewriters, there was no chairs, there was no nothing.
Well, there were 10,000 file cabinets or so, steel file cabinets in this building, but this is the only one that they could find. Where do you think 10,000 steel file cabinets went? I found steel filings in the dust samples that came up to the magnet in the samples that were given to me by Jeanette McKinley, who lived across the street from the South Tower and collected this dust. You could pick this file cabinet up in your pinky. How did it survive? Oh, it was in the basement. Interesting. Why do we have 700 bone fragments the size of a grain of rice found on top of that skyscraper? Can that be explained by a gravitational-induced pancaking collapse where we would expect bodies to be trapped between floors, not pulverized to this incredible degree? The plane that hit the South Tower came over the Deutsche Bank building where the bone fragments are found and sent its ejections out the other side. So they're not from the people in the airplane. Is that me? That's terrible. Turn off your cell phones, please. And, we believe this is evidence, direct evidence of explosive destruction. We'll get to number 9 and 10 again tomorrow with Kevin Ryan's and John Cole's testimony. Fire can't account for any one of these, let alone all 10 of them. With additional corroborating evidence that we've seen, we believe this is proof of controlled demolition. The truth about 9/11 appears to be much darker than we have possibly imagined. We've seen that explosives were used to destroy these 3 skyscrapers. And of course, it takes months of advanced planning and engineering to place such explosives. Who had the means, the opportunity, the motive to engage in this crime? Who benefited? These are the classic questions that crime investigators and journalists should be asking, but are not, and that's the purpose of the Toronto hearings this week. Who had access to these highly secure buildings? Who had access to these extremely sophisticated explosives that you're going to learn about tomorrow from Dr. Niels Harrit? The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth don't speculate about these issues. We don't have conspiracy theories. In fact, the laws of physics are incapable of caring about conspiracy theories. The evidence we've seen tonight is just a small fraction of the vast body of information that the 9/11 Truth Movement has put together for you. The questions raised are numerous and ominous that have yet to be answered. It's the hope of the 1,500 architects and engineers that I represent that these hearings prove quite successful toward getting all of us a new investigation. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We will now move on to questions from our panel. Yes, Professor Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Gage. Remarkable presentation and very persuasive. The modeling that NIST did on the World Trade Center 7 building, those models have not been released as I understand it. Is there any possible way that we can obtain those models and test them? They should be in the public domain because we need to learn about how high-rise steel buildings come down with fire.
Indeed. No, they won't be released into the public domain because it might jeopardize public safety if they were. That is the reason that given to us from NIST that they will not release them. And of course, there are other reasons that must be in effect for their non-release. But we continue to try there are several in this room who have indeed written FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, and have been denied for this information. There is no explicable reason for the denial of this information. And the reason we don't have the structural drawings either of either of these three skyscrapers, and those are being held also from the public for no reason that is justifiable.
Professor Lee and then Professor Jenkins.
Also, thank you for an excellent presentation. And I have a couple of quick technical questions, and then perhaps in round two I can come back to something deeper. Is there any significance to the very different look of the controlled demolition of the Towers 1 and 2 and Tower 7? Towers 1 and 2 had these gigantic pyroclastic clouds, and Tower 7 was more classically in the textbook because it just went down without enormous lateral movement.
Yes, well, we have visual evidence that there's extreme explosive forces at play in the Twin Towers, hurling without regard to public safety or the care of the surrounding buildings, many of which were quite destroyed. And the question is, why did they do it that way? It didn't look like a pancaking collapse. Couldn't they have made it look like a pancaking collapse like World Trade Center 7? We might have believed it more had that been the case. My speculation, and it's just that, is that they didn't have access to the perimeter columns as much, perhaps. So they had to have enough explosive force to take out not only the core columns, but the floors and everything else in the building. And by default, that pressure sent these free-flying objects in such speed and distance. This is a great question to ask Mr. Chandler tomorrow, of course.
Okay. Another quick one, and this may also be raised tomorrow as well. The eyewitnesses, and now you've assembled quite a few of them, describe two different kinds of prior explosions prior to the collapse of the building. Boom, 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 and boom. And so from what you have been learning about the way these demolitions operate, what would be the explanation for the two different kinds of explosions? If that is, an interesting question.
Yeah, I want to make sure I understand it before I open my mouth again, too. The different types of explosions in World Trade Center 7 versus the Twin Towers. Let's go back to 7. Normally, the controlled demolition industry uses high energy explosives, which have very loud bangs, very bright flashes. In the case of Building 7, a deceptive controlled demolition, they don't want those signatures because it would be obvious. And so we have a good reason to use something else, like thermite, which we're going to be hearing about tomorrow. It's quieter. It's actually more effective in recently patented cutter charges in the last dozen years or so. Does that help, or did I get off on the wrong track?
I'm sort of following up a line of inquiry that may or may not lead to anything, so let's just leave it at that.
Okay. Sorry if I missed it.
Professor Jenkins.
Thank you. I've been trying to get some sense of the magnitude of the effort or the job required to set these buildings up for this kind of controlled demolition. And one aspect of that that's relevant here is the question of whether to get the kind of collapse which we saw, would you have to have charges on the perimeter columns in the towers? To get a symmetrical collapse with very few remains of the perimeter columns, would it be necessary to cut many of those columns as well?
I believe so, The question is, did they have access? Is there evidence of that? I think you'll find tomorrow that Mr. Chandler has documented evidence of that. But maybe also it would be enough to have that explosive force from the inside, the core column area, if that explosive force was enough to push out and break the bolts that connected those individually welded subunits of perimeter columns together, 3 columns and 3 spandrel panels. So that's a great question, and there's some indication due to the bolt patterns and the ends of those perimeter columns not being sheared off. There's a lot of bolts missing. There's holes that are not warped in the 4 bolt holes that connect those 2 together. Some have theorized that somebody got into the building well beforehand, removed many of the bolts. So that's another possibility that would weaken the lateral resistant capability of those and make them more vulnerable to flying out individually due to explosive forces.
I suppose the question is whether you could get the symmetry that we see from an explosion that had its source in the center.
Yeah.
It would have to cut the perimeter rather simultaneously and evenly in order to get that.
Ideally, and you know what, that's possible that might have even happened. I don't see enough localized explosives in each of the perimeter columns, 3 feet 9 inches on center. What I'm seeing is more of a general explosive. Now, you'll see, hopefully tomorrow, some of these very isolated explosives on the corner columns that Mr. Chandler will hopefully enlighten us with. But as far as the individual columns, I don't see them being cut. Maybe I'm not seeing it. Oh, and you see, down at the ground, these columns are laying everywhere, these perimeter wall units. We don't see evidence of those perimeter wall units being cut, not much evidence. We see that lots of the ends of them individually, and they're fairly clean with 4 bolt holes in them. So that also leads me to believe that they didn't systematically cut the perimeter columns.
I have one more question. It's one you may not want to entertain. You have argued that the very clear evidence of demolition of World Trade 7 has strong implications about how the towers came down. And I agree with that in general, but there is a puzzling point here. The overall global motivation, we are told, for this bringing these towers down is to enhance a Pearl Harbor effect. I don't see how the destruction of World Trade 7 could be encompassed with that global motivation. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that the same terrorists couldn't have more than one motivation. But nevertheless, I think it is clear, I think other people would agree, the towers have already come down. There has been a horrific loss of life. What is added to the Pearl Harbor effect by bringing down Building 7? In fact, if you were trying to get a Pearl Harbor effect enhancement from 7, you would publicize it. But in fact, it hasn't been publicized, as you pointed out repeatedly. If anything, the information about Building 7 has been suppressed. Yeah. So I'm left with a puzzle about the motivation for the destruction of Building 7, and the fact that I cannot see it being continuous with the motivation for the destruction of the towers leads me to think that there's something here that might suggest different actors involved in the 2 kinds of destruction.
Interesting speculation. I really appreciate that. What is evident is that they didn't want us to know about it. It appears that it was supposed to go down under the cover of the massive dust cloud created and smoke cloud created by the Twin Towers destruction 15 minutes earlier that morning. And since it didn't go down at that time, they had a huge problem on their hands. That's my speculation. And they solved that problem by sending those workers in there, fixing the problem with the dud, and moving everybody back and telling everybody there was structural damage when in fact there's no indication of much structural damage, particularly from the debris. And so I think they did the best they could with a very nasty situation and just kept the media out of it altogether as much as best they could. There were certainly economic imperatives from the owner of the building. Larry Silverstein purchased in a 99-year lease the entire complex, having already owned Building 7. So it's very possible that he wanted a complete site to rebuild from. That's just speculation, though.
Could I just have one final, very quick question? If I could remember what it was going to be. Is it very clear to you that you would have had to have extensive foreknowledge, extensive in time, in order to set up Building 7 for demolition? It could not have been done on 9/11.
This is correct. It would take months and dozens of operatives.
Thank you.
Judge Imposamato and then Professor Lee again.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Gage. Without explosion, do you think that the Twin Towers buildings would have collapsed the same? The first dome, the same?
If there were no explosions, would the jet plane impacts and fires have created a collapse that might have looked like what we believe is an explosive demolition, a unique one?
And the second...
Wait, could I answer that one first? Because I'm rapidly aging as well. So, as well as our previous speaker acknowledged is what I mean, not you. So, you're asking an architect to speculate how a high-rise structure might have collapsed when one has never done that, first of all. There's no precedent for fire collapsing a building. But there's a high-rise steel frame or concrete frame building. But there's plenty of precedents for buildings that do collapse due to fire, aside from jet plane impacts. They fall over to the path of least resistance. They don't fall straight down through the structural strength. It's like cutting a tree. If you cut a tree, is there any chance it can go straight down through its strength? No, and turn to sawdust, too, on the way down. Not going to happen. But say there was the most massive fire that was 3,000 degrees, and you'll learn about how hot these fires were tomorrow versus how hot they needed to be to produce the evidence that you're going to be hearing about tomorrow. It's possible that a steel frame skyscraper could collapse under extraordinary, like blast furnace conditions, and it might have fallen over. It would have fallen over. Okay, I'm ready.
Anyway, do you think that the explosive has been the main cause of collapse or a secondary cause of collapse?
I'm sorry, I missed that. Secondary what?
Cause.
Were the explosions the main cause of the collapse or a secondary cause?
Yes.
My belief is that they were the main cause. This building could not have started a collapse under the conditions, even with jet plane impacts severing several columns. NIST said the building did its job. It stood, and they said it succumbed to fire. And you'll hear about the temperatures associated with those fires as well tomorrow. They could not, at 250 degrees centigrade, have compromised this steel.
Okay. The third question is, your scientific expertise has been confirmed by many witnesses. It is possible to get the witnesses transcript entirely, the transcription of the witness that you have show the house.
You would like to see the transcripts
yes.
of this,
Should be
of the
important.
video clips that I played you.
That-
Yes, we can get those for you. The original transcripts, I don't even know where those are. That would be a great question for Graham McQueen, who will be speaking about 150 witnesses of explosions who are very well documented tomorrow.
Thank
Yeah.
you very much.
You're welcome.
Professor Lee.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on Herb Jenkins' interesting, provocative question about Building 7 and what purpose was served. Was the Pearl Harbor agenda furthered by the destruction? And I had formed the following thought, which I'll throw out to you now and to the steering committee in general. We need to combine the skills that Paul Zaremka brought to us this morning on studying corporate activities and bring that to bear on the tenets of Building 7, including the Security and Exchange Commission, the Secret Service, the CIA, and who knows who else. So, and of course, the excellent skill set that Richard Gage and his colleagues brings to this work is not the skill set that we need to sort of dig into how many cases that were about to be prosecuted were abandoned because the Building 7 was destroyed. So I'd just like to throw that out if you or anyone else wants to comment on it.
I have no comment on that. Does anyone else?
Over 1,000 cases were destroyed.
So that seems to me one thing we can think about is a task force that starts on that line of inquiry.
Thank you, Professor Lee. Yes, Professor Johnson.
I'd like to go back to the topic of explosions. Clearly, the top of the building was demolished, the buildings were demolished, the Twin Towers, by massive explosions. Have there been any attempts to calculate the quantity of explosives, perhaps in tons of TNT, the equivalent, to make those buildings, the tops of those buildings, disintegrate the way they did? And have we had any independent reviews by explosive experts of affirming that these explosives are available generally, or from what source they might have come? This is a very unusual event, and these explosions are very massive.
Yes, the second question I'd like to leave for our expert testimony tomorrow, people who have a lot more insight into these matters, Kevin Ryan particularly, and Niels Harrit, and John Cole, and David Chandler. The first question already went through, so could you send it again? I told you, I warned you, and I proved to you that I'm aging.
Have there been any estimates of the quantity or the size, the mass
Oh, yes.
of these explosions?
Yes. Well, what you're going to learn tomorrow is that there is actual physical residues of the explosives and or incendiaries, as we'll learn about them tomorrow. There's a quantity that can be established based on the sampling that was found. And we'll learn about that tomorrow from Professor Harrit. As far as explosives experts that would say how many tons of TNT equivalent it would take, I think Professor Harrit might be able to answer that one. I'm setting him up already. I haven't heard such a number, but I have heard that in terms of the nanothermite explosives that we're going to be hearing about tomorrow, there must have been at least 2, 3, or 4 dozen tons of this material brought in through the eyes of security, unless they were sleeping when this happened. And so we certainly want an investigation of the security company, who was that, Stratosec, Securicom, who had the contract for the security in the whole complex until 9/11, until that date. That was the date that ended in their contract, or the day before.
May I follow up? Excuse me. Follow up with another question. The explosions occurred, it appears, just above where the airplanes hit. Is there any possibility that the explosives were brought in by the airplanes?
Sure, there's a possibility. You're not allowed to bring explosives on airliners, though. So if Homeland Security was in charge of those airplanes, I can't imagine them allowing that. But let's say that they did. And the planes hit and explosives went off. I mean, there was a big explosion at that time. That would not explain the rapid series of explosions all the way down the building, wrapping around the building like a belt, like the first responders describe. It wouldn't explain the free-flying objects that are responding to an equivalent set of forces traveling down the building, pushing them out. It might explain some of the other phenomena, but it's certainly not enough to do the job. The key is the equidistant explosive source. After all, there are 10,000 file cabinets missing or so in this building. 110 floors are missing or so. And so if a localized extreme force at the top is not going to account for complete destruction of this building down to the ground.
Are there further questions from the panelists? No. We will bring this session to a close then, and thank you very much, Richard Gage, for your presentation.
Thank you.